This is a rig tour of our friend Jonathan's pedalboard. We're going to go through all of the different pedals in the signal path, as well as modifications and customizations that were done specifically for this rig. In addition, I will take you through all the different varieties of ways you can hook this pedalboard up to a variety of different amplifiers. And I'll start first with the buffer interface where the signal path begins. In the top right here, the guitar will enter into the backside of the buffer interface and go directly into the Area 51 wah. This is passive, so there is no input buffer at this point. I found that the Area 51 wah responds best to a straight guitar signal and doesn't like a low impedance signal that would be provided by an input buffer. From the Area 51 wah, it returns back into the buffer interface into the input buffer. So it goes in and then out from the input buffer and goes directly into the crocodile tail loop, the One Control OC10. The One Control OC10 then links out through loops 1 through 7. So loop 1 is a Snow White Auto Wah by Mad Professor. Loop 2 is an MXR Phase 90 modified by Analog Man for a true bypass and LAD. Then to the loop 3, the Multi-Comp by EBS. Loop 4 is the Exotic EP Booster. Loop 5 is an Ethos Overdrive. Loop 6 is a Hartman Analog Flanger. And loop 7 is a Vertex Landau Stereo Chorus. From loop 7, we then exit the One Control and go into the Vertex volume pedal. From the Vertex volume pedal, we then go out to the interface into the output buffer, which goes into the front of the amp. Now, if you're going to run this particular rig through an amplifier with an effects loop, and for Jonathan, he uses primarily Dumble style amplifiers, most of which include an effects loop in the amplifier. You would then, after running again out from the volume pedal to the front of the amp, you would then go out of the effects send in your amplifier. You would come back into the interface, and it would plug back into the crocodile tail loop, the OC10 here. It would then go to loops 8, 9, and 10. Loop 8 is a Strymon Lex, loop 9 is a Strymon Timeline, and loop 10 is a Strymon Flint. These three loops would then go back out of the One Control and return to the effects return on the interface. Another option via the toggle switch in the back of the buffer interface will allow you to run loops 8, 9, and 10 in line with all of the other effects if desired. So if you had an amplifier, for example, that did not have an effects loop, you could use the toggle switch and disengage the separation of loops 1 through 7 through loops 8 through 10, and you could run them all in series in front of the amp. Another way that you could do this is if you had a wet-dry setup, you could leave it in the effects loop position where the effects loop is active. You would still take the send coming out of your amplifier that had an effects loop. You would still go through the same way that we would before through loops 8, 9, and 10. However, instead of going back out and returning to the effects loop amplifier return, you would instead take the return and go into the input of another amplifier, and then you could run the system wet-dry. So you have three different ways that you can run it. You can run it all in front of the amp, you can run it in an amplifier effects loop, or you could run it in a wet-dry context. Some of the modifications that were done to this system: I modified this amp foot switch to be compatible with all of Jonathan's Dumble style amplifiers. I've also changed the way that the cable coming out of this is terminated. Originally it was terminated with a Canon style connector, and I converted it to a MIDI protocol DIN style connector. And this just gives us a little bit more flexibility if for some reason Jonathan decided to change interfaces in the future. This is a pretty standard way that I would put a foot switch and integrate it into a buffer interface. So this will just give us some different varieties if we needed that in the future. I also terminated all of the different amplifier cables that would typically go from the foot switch to the amplifier so that they would accept MIDI on the interface side, and then of course would be terminated with whatever their amp required on the amplifier side. So you have all of those different options. The other thing that I did is modify the buffer on the one control so that it was identical to the Vertex output buffer that would be found in the Vertex dual and tri buffers, and I just found it gave a little bit more fidelity to the return going back to the amp from the effects loop or going into the front of a wet amplifier. So in other words, the buffer that I've modified in the one control only goes either back to the return of an amp effects loop or into the input of a wet amp. Sometimes those can be longer lines, just like you would find going into the input of your amp, and so I wanted to make sure we maintain the signal fidelity there. And we've had a really good success matching Vertex buffers with Dumble style amplifiers, as we found with our clients like Robin Ford and others who use Dumble amplifiers exclusively. If you have any questions about this, please feel free to comment below and like this video. If you like the content, please visit us at vertexeffects.com for more information on this pedal board and more details, and look forward to more upcoming videos like this in the future.